Hello, everyone. I have a very special guest today. We have Dr. Gina Riley, PhD, who is a clinical professor and program coordinator of the Adolescent Special Education program at CUNY-Hunter College in New York City. Dr. Riley has extensive experience in online education and distance learning at the college university level. For the past 18 years, Dr. Riley's research has concentrated on topics related to homeschooling, unschooling, and intrinsic motivation, self-determination. An interest stemmed in part from unschooling her own child from birth up to 12th grade. He is now 24 and now in grad school. He's always been unschooled. And recent peer-reviewed articles have focused on young adult unschooling outcomes, homeschooling, and intrinsic motivation, unschoolers who also identify as LGBTQ, and how unschoolers learn to read. Her first book, Unschooling, Exploring Learning Beyond the Classroom, will be published by Palgrave Macmillan in the fall of 2020. That sounds exciting, Gina.
It is. Thanks. So good
Well,
to be
welcome.
here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Super excited to have you here. And if you could we could just start off by telling everyone how you got started in studying intrinsic motivation and self-determination, because I'm really fascinated by the subject since my kids are learning in a self-directed manner. And I also recently read an article where employers, at least in the US, were complaining that a lot of their millennial employees are wanting rewards above and beyond being paid. So what is this all about? How did you get into intrinsic motivation and self-determination?
Sure. So my experience and interest stemmed from really thinking about homeschooling my own child. So this was 1996, early 2000s. Martin Seligman had just come out with this like groundbreaking article about positive psychology and turning people's, not focusing on people's weaknesses and instead focusing on people's strengths. And I just thought I was studying psychology at the time. And I just thought, how amazing is this? And then I was reading a New York Times article and came across Edward D.C. and Richard Ryan at the University of Rochester, and came across their self-determination theory, which is just all about intrinsic motivation, all about doing what you love, doing what you're passionate about. And to me, like, that's exactly how I wanted to live my life. And it's exactly, of course, what I wanted to facilitate in my own child as he grows. So yeah, the interest really stemmed from 2 articles and homeschooling and unschooling.
Awesome. Okay, so for a lot of people who are new to homeschooling and unschooling, can you just let us know in your words what you think unschooling and self-directed learning is? I mean, they're similar, right? Some people prefer one term to the other.
Yeah, so we've always said that unschooling itself is just learning through life, learning without dependence on curriculum, and really following a child's own intrinsic motivations and strengths.
Excellent. Okay, great. So the child chooses and the parent facilitates and guides and
Yeah.
makes it happen. Great. Okay, so but can kids really learn without school or without a teacher or parent directing them?
Yeah, of course, they probably learn best without a teacher or parent directing them, right? Even when I teach my teachers, which I do for most of my day, it's all about not teaching, but facilitating. And the most important thing for parents and for teachers of all sorts is to be able to really facilitate a love of learning in their child.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about the subject. It's not about the thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's really about just that facilitation of loving exploration and loving learning.
Right. And so they will just know how to learn. They'll love learning. They'll never lose the love of learning, which a lot of the public and private school kids are suffering with, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know what? It's not, so we know that our kids can learn things by themselves. We watch them learn to walk. We watch them learn to talk. We watch them acquire language. We know it's there. And so really part of this, it's up to us to just continue on that track.
Right.
I think sometimes we stifle by forcing or by saying, hey, don't you want to do this? Right? And so when we do that, we kind of squelch any sort of self-determination or self-direction or intrinsic motivation that our kids naturally have and have naturally had. So yes, it is absolutely possible for students to learn on their own
Mm-hmm.
with only slight facilitation.
Okay, but do you support strewing, putting things in their path that they might want to learn or not?
I support anything that works for the particular child.
Mhm.
So some kids might need some like putting stuff in paths and looking at stuff. And others really don't. Others really just have this natural sort of exploratory, curiosity driven function and do well with that. So again, I mean, for me, it's all about reaching the particular child. And as we know as parents, every kid is individual. So every kid needs something different.
Right, right. Okay, so can you tell me a little bit more about self-determination theory and what role does intrinsic motivation play in it?
Yeah. So self-determination theory is academic theory, again, BC and Ryan, University of Rochester, 1985, but it's really all about intrinsic motivation. And it's all about increasing individual passions, increasing individual interests, and really having people do what they love. I mean, most of us know what we love and what we really want to do with our time and with our life.
Right.
And so self-determination theory is all about, having kids and adults
Mm-hmm.
be able to self-direct and be able to do what they want to do and what
Right.
they're motivated to do.
Right. Yeah. And this is what happens with children before they start school and with adults after they leave school. Is this is when we learn something or are passionate about a new hobby or interest. That's what it is, folks. And your kid's going to learn that way.
It's so interesting, right? Because we think it stops there. So we think it stops at 5 and then it restarts when we get to do what we want to do, right? But who then said that it has to? Why does it have to start at 5? Why does when we get out of high school or college be the time where we get to do what we want to do?
Exactly.
We should be training really kids for this their whole entire lives, right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so what are the benefits of promoting intrinsic motivation and self-determination in one's child? Why is this important?
It's amazing. I mean, the benefits are you have more enthusiasm and happiness, right? You have love of learning, love of skill. And who doesn't want that?
Right.
Everyone wants their kids to like embrace things and be excited about things and live life with that sort of excitement. So the biggest benefit is you have happier kids.
Yeah, yeah. Who probably do better academically in the long run.
Yeah, who do better throughout, right? Like academically, socially, emotionally.
Right.
And I think the social emotional portion is just as important as that academic portion.
Exactly, totally. Okay, I'm going to play a bit of a devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
What is wrong with extrinsic motivation? What are some of its weaknesses? I mean, what's wrong with just motivating kids with external things like grades or money or public recognition or praise or candy or stars? What's wrong with that?
Yeah, nothing wrong with it, right? And I'll be the first person to say I am not anti-extrinsic motivators. I know how well they work at the time, right? So if a kid wants something and it's motivating to them and you can give it, they will work for it. I have done it. My son has done it. Everyone has done that. The thing with extrinsic motivators is that they are not long lasting. So you won't see that long lasting motivation. You'll see people doing things for the thing, right? And so most times, candy works for your toddler and for your kid in elementary school, but for your kid in high school, candy might not work anymore. So the motivators get more extensive and more expensive as time goes on, right? Think of how as adults, what we are motivated for. Rarely we're motivated for like a bag of Skittles. Instead, we want that like new bag or new pair of shoes, right? So these motivators get expensive and they're not long lasting. So intrinsic motivation really creates this more long lasting, sustaining motivation. And it's the most important type of motivation. Again, extrinsic motivators are not evil in and of themselves. It's just that they're very short-term solutions and they're band-aids.
Right, right. Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to think of when I had goals and I said, okay, if I reach this goal, then I'm going to reward myself with a cool vacation or something.
Right? And you're like, my gosh, yeah, it's traveled from the Skittles, you
Yeah.
know? So, uh, absolutely.
Okay, so, but how does a child or student or even adult behave when they're relying on extrinsic motivation to drive them? And how do we get out of this trap or rut, to motivate our kids or ourselves to do things?
Yeah. I mean, I think that traditional society is based on extrinsic motivators, right? Most of us wake up to an alarm, and that alarm is our extrinsic motivation to wake up. And then as we go throughout our day we get paid every 2 weeks, and that's an extrinsic motivator. Kids get grades every semester, and that's an extrinsic motivator. So, I mean, we live in this whole world that's based on extrinsic motivation. I think what we've seen, interestingly, through this pandemic is that that's really not the thing that matters, right? The thing that matters is not the income. The thing that matters is not even really the grade. I mean, exams have been canceled. You know, if you're studying for end of the year exams, they're not really there anymore because of this pandemic. And so those motivators have kind of left us, and they've left us like picking up new hobbies. And they've left us really thinking about, ooh, what do we like? What do we not like? In my neighborhood in suburban New York, more kids are playing outside and really like practicing what really interests them. I see kids playing sports, and I see kids like just practicing an instrument, and it's really cool to watch. So if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's really that, extrinsic motivators are there and will always be there, but it's not what sustains us. And certainly it's not what makes us happy. And so we've kind of had to find out what really makes us happy.
Excellent, good. Okay, so if we're on the bandwagon to try this, what are the key ingredients to unlock intrinsic motivation? How can we as homeschooling and unschooling parents create environments for our children that foster this intrinsic motivation and self-determination? You did write before in an article, according to self-determination theory, intrinsic motivation is innate. However, the maintenance and enhancement of intrinsic motivation depends upon the social and environmental conditions surrounding the individual. So could you please elaborate on all this?
Sure. So it's all about those social and environmental conditions that surround the individual. I'll always say that you can't force intrinsic motivation or self-determination, because that would be extrinsic. You can only facilitate it. And the way you facilitate it is through what DC and Ryan would call cognitive evaluation theory. Like, long name, fancy name, really simple. And all cognitive evaluation theory is it outlines 3 tenets. And these are environmental tenets that you could use as a parent or as a teacher, or wherever you're from, to facilitate intrinsic motivation in individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So the 3 things are a sense of competence, a sense of autonomy, and a sense of relatedness. And we'll break them apart. So competence is really important, and facilitating in children and teens competence is really essential. So this means that we are really focusing on your own child's strengths, and we're really focusing on their interests, and we're giving them credence, and we're giving them, almost like compliments. I mean, praise is a little extrinsic, but we're giving praise and compliments about those specific strengths. So it's not just like, great job on that, like that learning that bar chord. It's like, I can't believe you learned that bar chord on guitar. That's really, really hard. That was really big. Right? We're not just like, wow, you're, good job in golf. It's that golf swing has really made, like, it's been really wonderful for you. And really noting these very specific things in your child's life, right? So that's really important. The competence part also comes from the internal feelings of competence that students feel. You know, when you see your kid like accomplish something, that they have that smile on their face, they feel like they really did it. And we really want to, as adults, like make those things happen a lot.
Mhm.
So you want to facilitate an environment where the sense of competence is really high. Because if students and kids have competence, then they have confidence, and that confidence allows them to really like take risks and explore things that they may not have thought that they could explore.
Right.
The second part of this is autonomy. As homeschoolers or unschoolers, this will not be a surprise to you. If you are public schoolers or public school parents, this might be a little scary. Giving your kids and adolescents a sense of freedom and opportunity for choice is scary, but it is so valuable, right? A lot of our kids go through life and they are told what to do at specific times. So if your kids go to school, they have to raise their hand to go to the bathroom. If your kids, are in an air, they have to they do math this time, they do like social studies this time. And there's not a lot of choice inherent, but choice is really important when it comes to facilitating a sense of intrinsic motivation. And so we have to lean on giving kids more autonomy, giving kids more free choice, giving kids more freedom in their everyday lives.
Mhm.
The third one is my favorite. Again, these are tenets that increase intrinsic motivation. The third one is a sense of relatedness. Kids need to have one person that unconditionally accepts them and allows them to make their choices no matter what. And then no matter what is the hard part, right? Like we want to unconditionally love our kids and unconditionally accept our kids. But sometimes we don't do that no matter what. No matter if they make a mistake, no matter if they take a risk that maybe, we didn't approve of. But providing that sense of relatedness, I have your back no matter what. I may not have liked what you did, but I have your back no matter what, is really important for students to develop a sense of courage, to develop this sense that they can take risks and that they can provide challenge for themselves and that someone will support them, whether they succeed, which is always wonderful, or whether they fail.
Mhm.
So that's really like the magic of intrinsic motivation is competence, autonomy, and relatedness, and providing that sort of environment for kids and teens.
Yeah, and I think as a parent, I don't know, I feel like we're biologically wired to take care of our kids, to keep risk away, to keep them from danger and making mistakes and all that. So it's hard. I mean, we have to kind of intellectually and then eventually emotionally let go of that natural urge to just put a bubble around them.
Yeah, and it's all about, listen, I'm the first parent that's super concerned about the health and safety of my child who's now a young adult and I have no control over that anymore, right? But I'll be the first parent to say that we like that bubble and we like that sense of control. But the truth is that our children are going to grow up and they're going to grow older and they're going to make decisions by themselves. And so it's really important that throughout life, we prepare them to be able to make independent, autonomous decisions by themselves.
Yeah.
So they practice in that, right? It's not like just when you're 18. I remember when I was 18, I was first allowed to make my own decisions. It was like, my gosh, the whole world is here. What do I pick, right? And sometimes I didn't make the best decisions. And so when you get that practice during your childhood and during your adolescence in making those decisions on your own with some autonomy, knowing that someone has your back no matter what, it's a really good practice for adulthood.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, that's true. I grew up with some kids who had really, really strict parents, and they would finally go off to college and they were like these star students in high school. And then in college, they kind of fall apart, or they party too much, or they do things that, oh, I finally am free. And so I'm going to do all these crazy things. And that's dangerous too. So, and you want them to have better judgment by by having practice
Yeah.
of trying things and failing and all that, and have the confidence, because otherwise I think they just go out in the real world to be quite naive, you know, and make mistakes. They don't have the street smarts or what have you.
Yeah. And again, it's not, we can never protect our children from making mistakes, right? We want to be able to as parents, but that's really not going to happen. Like, raise your hand if you've never made a mistake in your life, right? Like, none of us, like, golly gee. And so it's really important that we know that, and that we encourage our kids to not only, that people make mistakes, but also that people can really learn from the mistakes they make and grow from it. And
Right.
again, so freedom and choice is scary, but it's also an opportunity. And so I really urge parents and teachers to allow kids to have that opportunity to
Mhm.
have choice and freedom in their lives.
Mhm. Okay, good. All right, so let's talk about giving advice to parents who have maybe a young child who never went to school, who's been homeschooled or unschooled their whole life, versus an older child who has. I mean, how do we as parents help them find what they're interested in and what they're motivated to learn? How do you, and then also, how do you transition a child who previously used extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation?
Yeah. So, I mean, intrinsic motivation is so inherent in little kids. They play, they know what they want to do with their day, they learn through that. And I'll always say that, like, homeschooling and unschooling, a little kid is super easy because you just allow them to sort of do what they want to do. And it's usually play, and they do that very freely, and they do that with very free choice.
Mhm.
The older child is a little different, right? Because the older child may have had different experiences. And sometimes if, like, the older child has a period where they went to school, then they're used to the more extrinsic schedule, right? They're used to doing things at specific times, and they're used to getting rewarded for doing things well. And that's why in homeschooling and unschooling, we talk about, like, sometimes if you're transitioning a kid from a traditional school environment into homeschooling, we talk about kids having a period of deschooling and being able to sort of take time to transition. And deschooling is really a transitional time where you're transitioning from one environment that's more extrinsically motivated to an environment that might be more intrinsically motivated.
Mhm.
And that transition time should contain lots of rest and lots of relaxation and lots of kids doing what they want to do, even if that's lazing around and playing video games all day,
Mhm.
right? Because that period, we all know that periods of kind of stagnation allow for greater periods of growth. And so the deschooling process is really important for the kid who has really transitioned from a traditional school environment to a more homeschool or unschool environment, because that's the transitional stage, and then you'll see a period of growth.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I have I'm friends with people who are making this transition from public private school to homeschooling or unschooling. And they're saying that, my kids are saying they don't know what they're interested in yet. They don't have any passions yet. And I think it's because that choice was taken away from them for a while, and it'll take time for them to, like, rediscover what they're into.
Yeah, if you haven't had that for a while, you don't know. It's like someone saying, like, what do you love? And you've been doing what other people have asked you all your life, and you're like, I have no idea,
Right.
right? It's why so many of our kids, when coming out of, like, 4 years of college, people say, like, what are you going to do for the rest of your life? And they're like, I don't know,
Mhm.
right? So it takes a period of exploration for them to figure that out. And
Exactly.
so it's time to transition and time to explore.
Mhm. Okay, but again, devil's advocate, isn't it a bit dangerous to give kids too much control? Isn't that what you would call permissive parenting? And what if they play video games all day?
And they play video games all day, right? And so, I mean, that's a choice that you as a parent have to make, in terms of parenting philosophy, what you really believe in, what you really want for your child, right? It's hard to want intrinsic motivation for your child, but then, like, also want strong structure and extrinsic rewards. You kind of can't have both, right? And so you kind of have to, again, I'll never judge a parent or a parent philosophy, because I think what works for a parent should be honored and respected. But if you really want your child to live an intrinsically motivated life, there are things that you're gonna, as a parent, have to let go. And some of that is a little bit of control, right? Like we all want to control because that's our natural inclination. It helps us feel safe. It helps us feel like we're doing something. And so if we're doing something, then it must be good. And sometimes what kids need is maybe for the parent to take a step back, listen more than talk, and then really honor a child's interests, even if that's something like that the parent may not pick for an interest, for example, video games. Once you honor it, and once you see why the kid is playing video games, you might be really interested, and it might be really interesting to ask that question, like, why? Right? Is it the images? Is it the being able to level up? Is it that you love technology? Is it that you love like computers and what phones can do and what gaming can bring you? Like it's all about that why, and it's all about listening to our kids.
Okay, interesting. All right, but what if there are gaps in a child's learning? They end up being 18 or whatever age, and there are big gaps in what they know because, you know, they chose what they want to learn. They were motivated to really focus on video games or really focus on origami or whatever they're passionate about. What about that?
Yeah, there's, I went to school for a long time, right? And there are still gaps in my learning, right? I was traditionally schooled, I have a PhD, went to school for a really long time. There are still gaps. Whether you go to school or whether you do not go to school, there are going to be things that cognitively you didn't get at the time. Unschoolers may have some of those gaps. And we know that from research that young adult unschoolers will say, yeah, there are definitely gaps in learning, but I learned how to learn. And so whatever those gaps are, whenever I needed to fill them, I knew how to fill them. And I mean, if we could think of one thing we want for our kids, it is really that we want them to learn how to learn. We want them to know how to learn and know how to find out things.
Right.
And if there's one strength to unschooling, that's it. Unschooled kids know how to learn and they learn how to learn. And so whatever gaps they have, they can fill, and they can fill pretty much independently.
Yeah, exactly. So is this the future of education? I mean, I know our discussion today is geared more towards parents who are homeschooling or unschooling or wanting to. Do you think that this will be a model for more traditional schools in the future? Will we see a push by parents, public and private school parents, for more intrinsically motivated, self-directed learning as part of school reform, which I'm hoping will happen, especially with the pandemic happening? So will the more exploratory elements of unschooling environment make its way into public schooling? Like if you could wave your magic wand to the whole school system around the world, what do you think can the traditional schools can benefit from?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, yes, the answer is absolutely. I think our whole point now, post-pandemic, right, is to really reimagine what education can be. And I think that school districts all over the country are doing this. They are reimagining all over the world what schooling can be and can look like. And so you see it happening slowly. You see school districts really leaning toward more choice in curriculum. They're leaning toward more freedom in terms of what kids learn and when. Virtual schooling has given us a whole, taste of what freedom of schedule might look like. So we are not going to go back to what we were. The hope is, and schools have already done this, you can look up High Tech High School in the state of California, the Independent Project in the state of Massachusetts. There are schools all over the country, including Sudbury schools and free schools and democratic schools and learning centers, that are doing intrinsically motivated, self-directed based learning. They're facilitating it in their students, and their students are embracing and enjoying it and really being quite successful at it. And so, yes, the hope is always that self-directed, intrinsically motivated learning will be the learning of the future. It will be what we imagine our schools to be. And I certainly know that our teachers want that.
Can you clarify, though, that the schools that you mentioned are those private schools or publicly funded schools?
Yeah, so High Tech High is a publicly funded school. The Independence Project in Great Barrington, Massachusetts is publicly funded as well. So some of these are, private school areas, your Sudbury schools, your free schools, your liberated learner schools. But there are also schools that are publicly funded that are really edging toward this, like, look what can happen. Look what can happen if we create a project-based school. Look what can happen if we create some self-direction within our class periods. And they're really experimenting with that and seeing success. And the more people see success in it, the greater it'll catch on. So yeah, I truly, truly believe that intrinsically motivated learning will be the future of education.
Okay, good. Let's cross our fingers.
Yeah.
Okay, so you did some pretty amazing research with Peter Gray, who many people know. I actually read it a few years ago, and it's actually a big reason why I went down this path. So thank you, Gina, for your research that you did. So can you tell us more about this academic research that you did with Peter Gray on unschooling, and which is the basis of your book, Unschooling, Exploring Learning Beyond the Classroom? And especially the outcomes. How many people did you research? What were the main findings, and how do these kids turn out?
Sure. The largest studies, of course, were with Peter. They were, our first study was 232 unschooling families. So we interviewed them. It was a qualitative grounded theory study, and it was the first large scale study of unschoolers to ever be done. And we found out so much about unschooling families that we didn't really know. So first of all, we found out about the spectrum of unschooling. When I was unschooling my child in the late 90s, 2000s, I mean, we didn't even call it unschooling. It was just like what we did. We were homeschooling, but we were kind of loose about it, and it was kind of what we did. And now we're noticing that people have defined a spectrum, given themselves labels. There's the relaxed homeschoolers and the radical unschoolers, and people define themselves as such. So that's always interesting to me because that wasn't always the case. We also found the benefits and challenges that families felt within the unschooling environment. So one of the huge challenges that families reported was the criticism they got from outside, right? Not the people inside, but the people, friends and neighbors and family. And that was a great big challenge. When someone is not embracing or accepting what you are doing, it just makes it harder for you to do that, right? So we found out about those challenges. And then, of course, like always with unschooling, the benefits seem to outweigh the challenges. And so families love the intrinsically motivated, self-directed learning they saw in their kids. Families love the family freedom of schedule. They loved the idea of education being based on student strengths. And they really saw, like, they saw their kids happier. They saw their kids more content. And of course, that made parents happier. So we did that study. And again, that was the largest scale study, 232 families. And we're looking at this and we're saying, well, what if the families weren't telling the truth, right? Like when you're doing something, right? Of course you want it to be great and wonderful and have enormous benefits, right? But what if, and we didn't, not what if they weren't telling the truth, but what if they were glossing over some things? So we thought, well, let's do a study of adults, young adults, who have gone through the process, and maybe they can tell us more about the process. So we did a study of 75 young adults, and we took that study and we put it into two parts, one focusing on college and employment and one focusing on experience. And those two studies were published in the journal Other Education. And gosh, those young adult unschoolers, again, like they said very similar things to what their families said. It was, a lot of it was no surprise. Families tended to say, no, my child has no socialization issues. And young adult unschoolers were a little bit more honest and said, the greatest thing about unschooling was age mixing and being friends with individuals of all ages. But did I sometimes feel isolated? Yeah, I sometimes felt isolated. But again, the benefits seem to outweigh the risk. Our young adult unschoolers had amazing outcomes. I mean, most did not have an issue getting into college. A majority of them had really great jobs, were financially independent. A lot of them went into creative arts fields. A lot of them were entrepreneurs. And interestingly, a lot of them went into STEM fields. And I always think that's like, wow, that's so interesting. But it makes sense because kids who are not in school spend a lot of time outdoors and with things, trying to figure out how things work. It's almost like the world was their maker space,
Mm.
right? So, I mean, that's always interesting to me about the young adult unschoolers. They've, again, benefits far outweighed the challenges. We had 3 individuals in the study who felt like their unschooling experience were negative.
Mm.
And I think it's important to highlight and outline that as well. Nothing is perfect, right? Interestingly, 2 out of the 3 had higher degrees, so they had PhDs or were going for PhDs. So I always think the outcome of that is interesting. But the 3 who had negative experiences lived in families where there were mental health issues, as well as that were highly religious.
Mm.
And so it was a real interesting mix, right? But even the people who reported a negative experience said, you know, if I wasn't educated in this way, I wouldn't have done what I've done in life.
Mm.
So I always think it's important, you know, also like all the benefits have been freely talked about, but people do have challenges, just like people have challenges within schools and the public school environment. So no environment is perfect. But again, the young adults, I mean, they were superstars. They really were. They had so many positive, amazing outcomes. Um, yeah. And I mean, I also have done research on my own on unschooling forever. And so I've done studies on unschoolers who identify as LGBTQ and unschoolers and learning to read, because that was really interesting to me. And then the relationship of attachment parenting and unschooling. I always think parenting styles and unschooling kind of go hand in hand. And so that study was also dear to my heart as well.
Yeah, well, that was my next question is what are the other projects that you've worked on, and what are you working on now? What's new? What's coming?
Yeah, so I'm super excited. A year ago, I got a book contract, like my first one, super, super excited. And it was all about just taking research on unschooling and really providing a narrative. It was, I say in the book, it was the book I needed as a 20-year-old single mother who chose unschooling. And I needed it to be written by an academic at a traditional school of education, right? I needed that legitimacy for whatever reason. And so I wrote the book that I didn't have. So Unschooling, Exploring Learning Beyond the Classroom will be published in September of 2020, something I'm super excited about. And then I continue to do research. Peter, I, and some other researchers are doing a large-scale study on Sudbury schooling, and continuing to do research on unschoolers who have kids with special needs. So I think, I mean, I'm so excited about those 2 studies, super excited about getting back into research after the huge project of writing a book. And then we also have an edited book coming out that Dr. Carlo Ricci and Jerry Mintz and I are editing. And there's so many amazing people who have been in self-directed learning spaces contributing to that book. So we're so excited about that as well.
That is awesome. And I think the timing is perfect because the whole world is super interested in this. And, you know, I think it's interesting because, you know, I've talked to some people who were not happy with the public and private school, what they were offering as distance learning or whatever. And they, you know, it's just subpar. And so they're looking into homeschooling, and some of them are initially signing up for these box curriculums or these very kind of traditional online things that's, you know, the kids watch a bunch of videos or do a bunch of assignments online, they get graded, and it's just blah. So I'm really hoping that more and more people know about unschooling and self-directed learning. And thanks to experts like you that have these amazing research studies, not just anecdotal things like my kids are fine, but you're actually doing real research and real studying to give like a little meat into it, real data. So I think that is fascinating, and I hope that people will see that this is a real thing. This is way better than so many other ways to learn, and we're not just all crazy hippie parents doing this. You know, we're some of us are academic or professional or entrepreneurial, and you know, really thinking about the skills of the future. And we think this is a great way for our kids to get there. So that's awesome. So tell us, Dr. Riley, how can people get a hold of you? Like, what is your website, or how can they read your research or writings? How can they order that book?
Yeah, so the book will be out again in fall of 2020, so they can order it through the Palgrave Macmillan website, as well as through Barnes & Noble's, Amazon, all your major retailers. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Twitter. I'm Professor G Riley. And since I'm an academic, I don't have a private website, but if you search Dr. Gina Riley at Hunter College, you will find me. Again, you know, yeah, it's really important. Note that I am a person who researches unschooling, who also teaches teachers for the New York City DOE. And so that balance for me has been essential in providing a perspective, right, on the work. And so, yes, I mean, we're not all crazy hippies doing this thing. We are making choices that are pretty now well-researched choices, and that could really change the world.
Yeah, I agree. And the world needs it. The world desperately needs it.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you, Dr. Gina Riley. This has been excellent. I really appreciate you joining us and sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much, Liz. I so appreciate you doing this.